Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 10th day of April in the year of our Lord 2026. My beat today is war. Once again, it's war, but I'm so tired of war. Each week, more war. I've decided to carve a niche out of the unexpected results of our current war, and that niche is NATO and its possible end for the United States. So I guess my beat is actually NATO today. I'm sure you all know what NATO is, but as a refresher, it's a treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in which the U.S., along with the other members, agreed to come to each other's aid if attacked. The purpose was to prevent and protect against a Soviet attack in Europe like the Nazis had done. Everything worked just fine when there was a Soviet Union to fight and to protect against. The Cold War justified the massive defense spending by the United States, which allowed Europe to rebuild from the war's devastation and to provide generous welfare benefits to its citizens. The fall of the old enemy, the Soviet Union, triggered a crisis in NATO because there was no longer a justifiable reason for its existence. The collapse of Russia and with it communism put the alliance under tremendous strain, especially when rising debt levels in the U.S. caused economic hardship. People would ask, why are American forces still deployed in Europe? Why can't Europe protect itself from perceived threats? Why do our families have to bear the brunt of Europe's defense? NATO continued to exist, although the reason for its formation, its existence, no longer existed. The reason smells like the military-industrial complex to me, the military-industrial intelligence security complex, that is. I'm sure that was a lot of it, but some vehicle of justification had to be found for NATO's continuation, and so it was found. NATO still exists today. American forces are still deployed in Europe today, although the reason is now obsolete. Moving the alliance to the borders of Russia, along with a coup that replaced Ukraine's government of pro-Russian elected officials with anti-Russian officials, might justify its existence. Maybe it would. Who knows? Maybe a new war could be started that would require hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending. Well, that's exactly what happened. And the Obama, Biden, Trump administrations have all handled it the same way. Pour money and weapons into Ukraine to fuel its war against Russia. Make the war last longer, be much worse than it otherwise would be. Perhaps if Ukraine were allowed to use American weapons to attack deep inside Russia, then maybe Russia would be provoked enough to attack outside Ukraine, but so far, no, the Russians haven't taken the bait. That has not happened. Meanwhile, back to present day, we find that although the U.S. poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine, ostensibly for the defense of Europe, when President Trump decided to launch a stupid, pointless, unprovoked attack against Iran, Europe seemed to want no part of it. Trump seemed to think that Europe should have been willing to support the U.S. out of gratitude for all the money, all the graves of America's sons scattered across Europe. NATO was much weaker when the U.S. and Europe saw Russia as an existential threat. The Ukraine war, despite all the bluster and propaganda, proved that Russia could not even conquer that small corner of Ukraine on the border of Russia. My theory then is that Europe no longer feels threatened by Russia, despite all the rhetoric to that effect, but it does feel threatened by the millions of Muslims it's invited into its countries and who now live among European populations. So Europe offers no help in Trump/Israel's war against Iran. Shockingly, even with our long special relationship with the UK, Prime Minister Starmer would not allow the U.S. to use bases in England, which the U.S. at least partially paid for, to refuel and rearm aircraft used in the attacks against Iran. Many U.S. administrations, including the Trump administration, have criticized Europe for not bearing more of the expense and sacrifice for its own defense. Trump has said that this is not 1949, he said. That was the year NATO was founded. Europe is perfectly capable of defending itself these days. This hostile rhetoric back and forth, along with the changing political climate in Europe, in which the European general outlook was fast becoming one of subservience to the new global world, run or at least managed by the bureaucrats in Brussels. Trump, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio have all made it clear that the U.S. would not follow that path, so Europe says no help in Iran. Even the European effort to keep the strait open is virtually non-existent. There is nothing in the NATO Charter that requires member states to support the U.S. efforts in Iran. The U.S. was not attacked, which would have triggered the Article 5 Common Defense Clause, so there is no charter obligation in their eyes. How about just friendship, gratitude, as Trump would put it? Well, I suppose the Europeans would say that friendship does not extend that far. In fact, we don't even like you, they might say. We don't like you, you're crass. You won't play by our globalist playbook, so why should we anger all the Muslims in our country? Supposedly Iran has missiles that could reach all the way to Berlin, possibly even further. They have proven that these missiles are still there, still working. They cannot be stopped if fired in volume. So I understand why Europe does not want to support the U.S. in its attack on Iran, but I don't understand why the U.S. remains in NATO. I'm very on board with Trump's constant threats to leave NATO because the time is long past when that should have been done. Unfortunately, I don't think it will happen because leaving NATO would require congressional approval. I don't think there is nearly enough support in Congress to leave. Otherwise, of course, another aspect of all this is that the U.S. created NATO, accepted the defense of Europe, not as a protection racket for Europe, but as a strategy to keep European nations from building armies and invading each other, which has led to 2 world wars. So that's the other reason NATO was formed. To me, this NATO issue, along with the 2-week ceasefire in Iran, represent the best possible chance for a new order to emerge from chaos, not a new world order as the Bush family used to talk about it, traditionally talked about by the Bushes, but an order in which the U.S. adopts a foreign policy designed to truly benefit the U.S. and its people. That would mean ending the special relationship with Israel, the beginning of treating Israel like we treat any other foreign country. Ending the special relationship with Israel is job number 1 if Trump truly wants to extricate the U.S. from the Iranian war. I think he does want that. Israel and its American lobby obviously do not want the war to end. Even if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, the global economy suffers. They want the war to continue. It appears that he is not any more grateful than NATO for U.S. help. If that is the case, Trump constantly threatens to leave NATO because, quote, they have been of no help to us, end quote, then why doesn't he threaten Israel with abandonment? The answer to that question would certainly explain a lot of things. The 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan apparently was something that had great promise for a new U.S.-Iran agreement that could have remade the Middle East. The idea of joint U.S.-Iranian control of the Straits makes sense to me. I saw it as a way to pay for some of the rebuilding of Iran by charging all those European and Asian tankers a toll for passage before the war. About 127 ships on average per day passed through the Gulf. Now it's down to 6. If each of 127 ships was charged an average of about $100,000 for passage through the strait, that's roughly $355 million per month using my crude math. That money would go a long way toward rebuilding Iran from the rubble it now is. Reports say the U.S. alone has dropped some 32,000 bombs on Iran since the attack started. That doesn't include what Israel has dropped. In any event, the U.S. taxpayer pays for all of it. We are the U.S. taxpayers, therefore we are responsible. This is a free country, or at least that's how much of the world views it. So since we are a, quote, democracy, we the people are responsible for its actions. That sounds good in theory, but in fact, we have no real way to change anything. When we're given the illusion that all we can seem to do is make a terrible situation worse. My toll charge system probably wouldn't work, though. It probably wouldn't work because it would increase the price of everything worldwide. But for the U.S., I'll bet it would be cheaper than war. Here in the real world, Trump reportedly told the Iranians they have a chance to be Persians again. That's a tremendous offer. That's a tremendous offer. And it shows the world that he does understand at least some of the history of the Persian people. Iran was created by Great Britain from ancient Persia after World War I. Trump is offering them an olive branch they could use to regain control of their oil and their shipping from Lloyd's of London and the English banking system. Why not leave NATO for a new order in the Middle East? The U.S.-led new order in the Middle East. Why not? Well, I'm glad you asked, folks. The answer is Israel. It's American lobby and the neocon globalist war party that seems to own everything, including all our lives. It's probably more than a coincidence that J.D. Vance is going to Pakistan to continue the very intense negotiations that brought this ceasefire to life. J.D.'s probably the least neocon of anyone in the administration. Could this really end in 5 weeks? Just 5 weeks. Vietnam took 15 years. Afghanistan, 23 years. Iraq, 18 years approximately. So we'll see, folks. We'll see. Finally, pray this ceasefire accomplishes more than the neocon war party wants it to. Pray for peace, folks. At least that's the way I see it. Till next time, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.